This is Susan Pitcairn. I've had an interest for a long time in many things, just like the mysteries of this world, things we're not really told, things that seem to be covered up. One of them is extraterrestrials and UFOs. And I recently did a documentary on that subject that's broken into 4 parts if you want to do it that way. And it's on YouTube and on Rumble under my name, Susan Pitcairn. This morning I was reviewing a book I had read some time ago by someone here in Sedona, a psychic, channeler, spiritual teacher named Gina Lake. And she's not ordinarily interested in UFOs and ETs, but in 1993-94 she was given some information by her spiritual guide, who at that time was a being from a higher dimension named Theodore. She wrote a number of really excellent spiritual books in conjunction with that entity. And in more recent years, she's working with, she says, Jesus, and has been giving a lot of online channelings and readings on Christ consciousness. Be all that as it may, meaning I don't know for sure. I have no way to totally verify any of these things that are channeled. I just listen to them and try to get a sense of whether the teachings themselves are valid, whether the teachings themselves are helpful. And I think a lot of what she has to say really is. Most of her books are on timeless spiritual principles. They're rather similar to the teachings of Eckhart Tolle in just a little different language. She has 2 books on ETs that are unusual, that stand out from the rest of her works in that they go into this backstory. Anyway, the information is very interesting and it does resonate with me, I have to say, and it makes even more sense to me now with the recent events going on in the world and with what I uncovered in my documentary than it did before. So I'm going to read some excerpts from it for you, and I think it might help clarify a little bit like who is here and why they're here, and how to discriminate amongst them, which seems to be an important thing to do, especially as we may, in the coming years, have increasing contact with them. So the book is called The Extraterrestrial Vision, Who is Here and Why, 1993, by Gina Lake. Also consider this a book review. I recommend the book, as well as her other books. They're very good teachings that she's giving. So, first of all, she says, I'm going to read from my Kindle here, that there are many kinds of ETs. There are ones that are service to self and service to others. Most beings eventually evolve, if not all, into service to others because service to self just doesn't work, basically. And she says that, though it may come as a shock to us, that our species really was seeded here long ago. We will go into that backstory in a minute. But first, it's important to understand that more recently there have been some other visitors arriving with their own agendas. Gina's guidance suggests that the Orion Greys are particularly significant here, that they have an agenda to serve themselves, to get genetic material for themselves through abductions, and also to hasten our downfall if possible, because they would like to take over the planet. Now, as an aside, there are other sources that say nowadays, recently, that they are working with the reptilians, who have an even more dominating kind of agenda, and have for a long time. I don't know, but I'm just sharing this with you. Their main tactic, she says, is fear, which we see plenty of in our world recently. According to this source, the agreement that was reached with the Greys in the 1940s was that we could have some of their technology, we would help them build it, we would allow a certain number of abductions to be done for genetic research for their own purposes. Also, importantly, that their presence be kept a secret. That would explain some things. And they threatened to destroy us if we did not comply with these demands. For more on agreements that were made in the 1940s and 50s, please take a look at my documentary, Grains of Sand. Now, what she says, the government fails to realize that this small band of ETs does not actually have the technology to destroy us, nor would they act so aggressively. And the second limitation of the Greys is that they're physically very weak with a short lifespan reduced by the conditions of the Earth. And they're trying to hybridize so they can adapt here, and they're hoping to take over the Earth when we create our own downfall. This is consistent with what I found when I was researching my documentary Grains of Sand, especially the part by Paul Schneider. The type that we've heard of that are sort of gray looking and the big bug eyes and so on, there's really two types, the Orion Greys. There's, I think, many types too, but in this book she describes two. The Orion Greys, which are more wanting to take over, and the Zetas, which are service to others who also have reasons to be involved with us themselves. They need our genes to re-engineer their own DNA so they do not die out. They no longer reproduce in the usual way, but through cloning, which has undermined their adaptability and consequently their ability to survive into the future. So they have their own reasons as well as helping us. They're particularly concerned about us because they see us taking the same path that they did. They too were more intellectually and technologically advanced than they were spiritually. And they created nuclear weapons, which in their case destroyed their planet, forced them underground, where they adapted and they learned to reproduce by cloning, but that's not a very long-term viable solution because it doesn't have enough diversity. So they're becoming weaker and weaker physically, and so they're simply wanting to use our genetics to strengthen themselves again and go on their way. The Greys, she notes, look like the Zetas because they share the same genetics and history up to a point. And they are also abducting people for the same reason as the Zeta, to save their own race. However, they developed into a service to self race and are also here to colonize the planet. So we need to learn to discern between those two types. I'll conclude this section by saying, while searching for images and so forth to illustrate this portion of the video on the Greys, I did some more reading on it online, and it appears to be a really complex subject. It seems to be that this is a very widespread race, or that has many permutations, both serving and others and serving themselves. And they seem to have an important role in the universe, have strong telepathic abilities, and so forth. I would refer you, if you want to dive into that deeper, to check out the link below. Moving on, now let's take a look at what this material has to say about humanity's galactic origins. Before today's situation can be understood, we need to look at what went on early in humanity's history, what ETs were involved, and how we were affected by them. The first humanoid race on our planet was not native to it, but came to Earth from the Lyrian star system. This small band of individuals, later known as Pleiadians, came to Earth to escape conflict on their home planet, of which they wanted no part. After settling on Earth, they experienced physical difficulties resulting from the difference in gravitation and atmosphere. And so to resolve this, they extracted genetic material from ape-like primates and combined it with their own DNA, which over many hundreds of years made them true terrestrials. This had no effect on the primates. But alas, the Lyrians whom they were trying to escape found their way to Earth and began a different genetic experiment. They took up the task of creating humanoids on Earth from the same primates that had helped the first settlers adjust. Now I'm adding a comment here. The book doesn't make it clear, but I think that the distinction is that the first group used basically themselves, adding some primate genes to adapt to Earth, and the second group maybe started more with primates and then added some of their genes to evolve them along. That's what seems to be being said here. So this first group of Lyrians found the second group's activities so unbearable, they were the same people they were trying to get away from in the first place, that they left Earth, traveled for generations in space, and finally found the Pleiades, where they settled and became known as what we now call the Pleiadians. And according to various sources, they seem to be the main ones who are here at this time to help us, along with Sirians, Arcturians, and others considered as part of the Galactic Federation of Planets, which was actually mentioned on NBC News in December 2020 as being a real thing. Because of their important connection to Earth and their love and concern for the humanoids of Earth, The Pleiadians have been monitoring you and involving themselves in your affairs to varying degrees. We call them Pleiadians, even though, really, they came in this form from Earth. So the Lyrians, meaning the second group of settlers, lived on Earth only periodically, while their humanoid creations were evolving. Remaining there for any length of time was physically uncomfortable, as it has been for the first settlers. They lived primarily in spacecraft and traveled back and forth between Earth and their home planets and others with which they were involved. Their involvement with Earth increased when the humanoids they created evolved enough to procreate with them. So they still couldn't live on Earth comfortably, but their offspring easily adapted, so they began periodically to mate with and mix with the human creations that they had made. And says these periods of infusion of ET genes sped up human evolution exponentially. These Lyrians, the second group, spawned offspring unlike the terrestrial parent with far greater intellectual and physical capacities, including increased size, agility, and strength. They looked different from those with more terrestrial blood, although these differences lessened over time as Lyrian genes became more integrated into the human race. Height was the most outstanding evidence of their involvement. They were more than 7 feet tall. Evolution this rapid created difficulties within the humanity, as can be imagined. Fighting and conflict were common, as were racial differences that contributed to competitiveness. Characteristics like tallness, light skin, and hairlessness became more desirable, leaving some members of society outcast or disenfranchised. Thus, racial struggles were born early in your history and were in fact part of the original Lyrian conflict. Enter the Sirians. Millennia later, Sirians, another group that fell claim toward Earth, arrived. They were not significantly different from Lyrians in their philosophy. They also felt a right, in fact a duty, to procreate with a developing humanoid species. There was not much the Lyrians could do about this, since they weren't inclined to disallow what they themselves promoted. So they managed to coexist for some time and even cooperate in raising and guiding the human race, but not without conflict and not indefinitely. The relationship between these two groups and the human race was like that of a parent to a child. They created a social hierarchy to oversee the training of humanity with themselves on top. Thus, they orchestrated the human race's social development, provided them with knowledge about agriculture, astronomy, construction, mathematics, science, and other such subjects, and taught them philosophy and esoteric and spiritual truths. As might be expected, many of the spiritual teachings were misunderstood or purposefully distorted by human beings, making their religions vacuous at best and dangerous at worst. Nevertheless, certain spiritual truths managed to survive, in part because Earth was visited periodically by advanced souls such as Krishna, Buddha, and Jesus, who came to remind people of basic spiritual truths. Many legends and biblical stories tell of humanity's early interactions with ETs, actually. Such as stories about the gods on Mount Olympus in Greek mythology, reflecting Lyrian and Sirian leadership in that area. Egyptian mythology also reflected Assyrian influence, though much of what filtered down is a distorted image of these gods. The Garden of Eden in the Bible is a story of humanoid creation, with the rib symbolizing the genetic exchange between ETs and early primates. Human society, history, and culture, religion, and all these things were shaped by ETs. They felt a responsibility for what they had created and felt compelled to share the knowledge and understanding they had gained in their own evolution. They felt spiritually responsible for Earthlings and still do. Moreover, they recognize their oneness with Earthlings as spiritual beings. In short, they love us. And that is why our fate is so important to them. Despite how arrogant and self-serving their interventions on Earth may seem, they were not. In serving you, they believed they were serving the Creator. Meanwhile, the story continues. The first group of settlers, the ones who were escaping Lyra's conflicts, and who later went to the Pleiades, the ones now called the Pleiadians, they did not feel comfortable with the level of genetic engineering being conducted by the second group of Lyrians and the Sirians. Because of their strong historical, genetic, emotional, and spiritual ties with Earth, they felt a strong need to oversee the other ET's activities and to protect us. The book says that at times they even intervened to help balance situations they felt could be harmful to us. The other groups, the Sirians and later Lyrians, were much more inclined to let us make our own mistakes and not to intervene, and this was a major divide between the two groups. She goes on. Sometimes the Pleiadians did more harm than good with their interventions. For example, they saw no reason for you to suffer from diseases they knew how to cure, so they gave you cures. They eased your suffering, but they didn't help you develop your medical knowledge. By removing the impetus for medical discovery, the Pleiadians actually delayed your intellectual growth, since the intellect is expanded by exercising it, not by being given answers or having no need to exercise it. It goes on. This is why we and others like us, and now the Pleiadians, will not give you answers to your problems. The Earth plane is a plane of polarities, and only by having difficulties and understanding and overcoming them can you evolve. So what this book is indicating is that service to other beings have dilemmas they have to solve, like how much to intervene and how much not to intervene. This source goes so far as to say that some of the worst disasters that happened to Earth could have been avoided had there not been intervention, and so is quite a dilemma for them. They are learning, they're not perfect, nor are we. So one of the most important lessons of this time, she notes, is with her guide, is discrimination, discerning things. All beings have lessons to learn at each stage of evolution, and ours are shifting as we move from the third dimension to the fourth dimension, she notes. Once you move into the fourth density, you will simply have different challenges, ones that relate less to survival and more to fulfilling your intellectual potential. The fourth density world of the future will be one in which you will be learning to function as a coordinated whole rather than as separate individuals, although your individuality will remain intact. So a lot of times lately we're finding that this dance between kind of hive mind almost level of conformity and individual sovereignty, this is a polarity, a dance that we're learning to resolve, to find some way to cooperate and work together and yet retain our individuality. That makes sense to me. So regarding this issue of interference, the Pleiadians had forgotten the importance of physical suffering. It had been so long since they had suffered themselves. But making mistakes, they were reminded of this, and they now work to share their understanding with others who might make this same mistake. Another mistake the Pleiadians made was to interfere in your wars. They appeared in visions to try to convince you of the irrationality of war. This had no impact because you were too emotionally immature to negotiate. You wanted to fight. Until fighting became more painful than not fighting, fighting will continue. You have only recently become evolved enough to settle your differences non-violently. You're open to this now because some enlightened individuals have managed to teach you peacemaking skills, and because you have no choice. The world is too small and you need each other's resources. So it goes on, the Pleiadians did more than just try to talk you out of fighting. At times they physically, or not so physically, intervened to jam your weapons or foil the inventions of new ones. This kind of interference is similar to what we and other spirit guides and teachers do to guide humanity. The difference is that those like us are more objective and evolved and have more experience acting as guides than the Pleiadians did at that time. But they've evolved considerably since then and now realize they were premature in playing that role and vow not to interfere like that anymore. They did not always have the best judgment, but their intentions were always good. Goes on, the Lyrians and Sirians were the main players in your history because they did not have the same compunctions about shaping you that the Pleiadians had. The Pleiadians intervened only occasionally and with altruistic motives. while the Lyrians and Sirians intervened regularly out of duty as overseers of their creations. Both groups, it says, figured heavily in the early parts of our history, but at some point the Lyrians all but dropped out and left the nurturing of humanity to the Sirians. The Sirians then took over until well into the Middle Ages, when they felt it was time for humanity to stand on its own. Since then, they have been monitoring our activities. The same is true of Lyrians, who have been monitoring us and occasionally walking amongst us, but rarely intervening. So all that hands-off thing happened soon after science and rationality began replacing religion. This period of non-intervention is ending, however. Not that any of these groups will intervene like they did in the past, but Earth is obviously in need of help, and the Pleiadians, Lyrians, and Sirians are answering this call. You are, after all, their creations and members of the same galactic family. Then it goes on with more detail about the Sirians, since they were our gods, and the Lyrians and Pleiadians played this role somewhat, but primarily the Sirians. They quickly took charge of the engineering of humanity, and they were experts in genetic engineering, and the Lyrians stepped aside in deference. They materialized often, the Sirians, in many forms, sometimes appearing godlike, enormous, handsome, beautiful, glowing. With this guise, how could you not assume they were gods or angels, sent to rule and instruct us? More frequently, however, they reincarnated as simple shepherds, stonemasons, tailors, and so on, so they could mingle with us and influence us in less dramatic ways. This was also a way for them to walk in our shoes and sample what being human is like, although their experience has never been quite like ours. They were like gods in human forms, and were usually recognized as such regardless of their garb. They could not hide their advanced development. They also became prominent members of society. Many of the remarkable men and women throughout history were either reincarnated Sirians or other advanced souls, such as Pythagoras, Socrates, Hippocrates, Plato. They were Sirian, as were many great political leaders. And every important position in history has been held at one point, one time or another, by Sirians. And they continued to do biological engineering on us until they withdrew in the Middle Ages and decided we could proceed without them. And the human race has also been greatly advanced by the periodic arrival of avatars like Christ, Buddha, Mohammed, Lao Tzu, and Krishna. However, many of their teachings have been distorted and so on. And that's no surprise. They brought them knowing this would happen. The alternative was simply to leave humanity in darkness. So they arranged for others to follow them who would correct the distortions. The Sirians believed firmly in letting you make mistakes so that you could learn from them. They understood your struggles would make you stronger. Therefore, not only did they protect you from challenges, as the Pleiadians occasionally did, but they sometimes even instigated challenges to catalyze your growth. For example, they gave you the tools by which you could destroy yourselves in Atlantis. It goes on that the Sirians were aware of the possible danger of showing you how to use atomic power, but they were willing to risk this because of the technological advances that atomic energy could bring. They didn't expect us to destroy ourselves, and they thought we could use it wisely. They also believed that they could prevent people from misusing atomic energy if necessary. However, the technology got into the wrong hands, and the Sirians could not prevent the disaster that followed. For this mistake, they are deeply indebted to the human race, and still repaying this debt in service. In trying to catalyze our growth by introducing atomic energy, they created tremendous karmic debt for themselves, as did those who misused this power and destroyed Atlantis. So it goes on to explain that the Sirians and others who are guiding Earth right now work more through the subconscious mind, through dreams, intuition, and feelings, and through channels and psychics. They're not limited to working this way, they just choose to do so. They have not taken a form on Earth for a long time and probably will not. They're leaving this up to others, whom you will come to know as extraterrestrials rather than gods. So who are these visiting us now? We'll examine 5 groups, and she goes on: the Pleiadians, the Sirians, the Orions, the Zetas, and the Greys. But there are many others, in fact, which explain the diversity of humanoids sighted and your confusion about what is going on. Actually, only one thing is going on. You are being helped into 4th density. This is no small matter, for rarely has a planet gone through such a change so swiftly. The Earth is evolving to a 4th dimensional planet, a higher frequency, where there'll still be dualities of good and bad and just contrasts, but it will be much more mild. We'll eventually move even beyond that to higher dimensions. She says one reason that we're being visited by so many different ETs is that Earth is transitioning in this way, and that we need help adjusting to this higher vibrational rates, which are having effects on our bodies. And it requires us to adapt as much as possible by eating a good diet, having pure air and water, a peaceful environment, and meditating. There's a trigger also in our DNA, she writes, that is part of the human experiment that brought us to this world, and is a gift from our creators, and it's to ensure our survival into the 4th density. Right now, it seems like we really are in the midst of a great shift. And she adds, we have to learn how to deal with our environment and our own sustainability issues. They can help to some extent, but it's not really their role to interfere. So the book goes on at some length into details about all of this, and I find it very interesting. It's difficult to know, of course, if it's exactly and totally true, and the author herself admits that, all channeling is in a way imperfect. So we just have to see. And I have also heard in more recent times of other significant ETs involved here now, such as the Arcturians. And then there's supposed to be some influence from a high council from Andromeda and others. I realize for some people watching this may be the first time they've heard of any of this, and it may sound really crazy, and it may sound very threatening to some of our lifelong beliefs and the things we've always been taught. But it is a time when a lot of strange things are happening, and it's time to open our minds up and see if there's a bigger picture that we could learn about. For other people, this is kind of old hat now, and that's an interesting thing too. We have all kinds of people in our world now at different levels of understanding or awareness of these things. We'll see as time goes on, but what's especially interesting about all this to me is just the idea that there are these different kinds of beings, the servers and the self-servers, and that all, like us, are apt to make mistakes. So I think, our greatest maturity, and I think our greatest lesson right now, which is also mentioned in this book, is to learn to not give away our power. We need to come into our own spiritually and to claim our sovereignty, our right to rule ourselves and to evolve. We need to develop our maturity as much as possible at this time, especially. So they're here to help us, it would seem, but the primary job is our own. And at an individual level, that seems incontrovertible to me. I mean, if you're suffering depression or confusion or upset in any way, especially about some of the events that have been going on at a global level in the last period of time, since 2020, then I think our real impetus at this point is not only to learn about what's going on, but to transmute it and to evolve, to transcend it, to realize that who we are and what we are is a soul. And that is part of our heritage from perhaps these other beings from other planets. But ultimately, where did they come from? Where did it all come from? From the source, from some mysterious and grand source, the same one which these advanced teachers and avatars have tried to tell us about. And I believe that there is a drop of that, or an ocean of that, in each one of us, and that our answers really are found from looking within. That doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to look outward, to see what's going on, to learn from it, to see what it is that we need to deal with, and also to look back at our history and learn not only fascinating things about human history as we've known it in the last few hundred years. And the significant event that was involved in the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the writing of the U.S. Constitution and those kinds of advancements. But also the more ancient history of humanity, which has a lot to teach us about who we are now and where we are going. Thank you for listening and watching